Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the Monday Morning Tennis Rant. And I'm going to start off with the tournament in Barcelona. And finally, Casper Ruud wins a 500. I talked about him being dragged on social media for being a player that only wins 250s, which is complete nonsense. Why? Because this guy not only was in the final of Monte Carlo last week, but he was also in the final of the World Tour Finals. He was in the final of 3 Grand Slams, 2 French Opens. He is one of the best clay court players in the world, and it was only a matter of time until he won a bigger tournament, and I was so happy to see him take the title in Barcelona, which is a 500, because there couldn't be a better ambassador for the sport of tennis than Casper Ruud. Now, the ATP recognized this and gave Casper the ATP Stefan Edberg Sportsmanship Award in 2022. Alcaraz won it in 2023. Both of these guys are great ambassadors for the game of tennis, and so is Sinner. And I do want to say that tennis is in such a great place right now. I heard an insane stat from Italy that during the semi-final match between Sinner and Tsitsipas in Monte Carlo, there were 3 football matches, or for the US audience, soccer matches going on during that match, and tennis beat out soccer in Italy, which is unbelievable. So tennis is blowing up in Italy. It's unbelievably popular, but it's popular pretty much everywhere. Yes, it's true that pickleball courts are being used more in the United States compared to tennis. But despite the fact that Djokovic is not playing right now, he just pulled out of Madrid. Nadal is on his last leg, so to speak. Federer retired. I thought there was going to be doom and gloom for the ATP, but it's quite the contrary. Tennis is as popular as it's ever been, and I think partially what's responsible for this is social media, because on Instagram and even on YouTube, the ATP Tour, the WTA, Tennis TV, the Tennis Channel, they're producing a lot more content, whether it's short form content, whether it's long form content. It's on a daily basis, and this content gets a lot of traction. I'm keeping tabs on this, and there's always great engagement, sometimes hundreds if not thousands of comments on every single post, which tells me that there is a lot of interest in the game of tennis, and tennis is doing quite well. And again, I did not think it was going to be like this. I was foreseeing bad times for the game of tennis, but I'm happy to see that this is not the case. Now, the big highlight of the tournament in Barcelona for me, because I'm such a huge Rafa fan, was that Rafa finally played a tournament and he beat Cobolli in the first round. He played really well in that match, and I thought that he was going to beat de Minaur, and he did play well in the first set especially. But a lot of people have reached out to me and asked whether I think that Rafa looks slower. And I do think that Rafa is a step or 2 slower on the court. Now, Rafa did say that he was gonna go all the way at the French Open, so maybe he wasn't going all out. And don't misunderstand this, it's not like Rafa was not trying his best, he was, but there's another level that you can go to where you're disregarding your body and you're going to the absolute limit, not caring what happens to you. And I think that's what Rafa plans to do at the French Open, give it one more go and go all out. He definitely wasn't doing that in the match against de Minaur. There were several drop shots that he didn't attempt to run down. And when he was running down drop shots or moving laterally, yes, he did look a little bit slower. Also, he was serving extremely slow in the first round against Cobolli, averaging around 100 miles an hour. He did ramp it up a little bit later during the match, so there's something going on with his back or his abdominals. And the hip injury does not appear to be healed by any means, because when Rafa is moving to his right side, his backhand side, definitely doesn't look like the old Rafa, because he's a little bit slow on that side and he does slice a lot more backhands than he normally would. However, I will say there were some vintage Rafa moments in those 2 matches. There were some unbelievable backhands that he ripped, and this was always something that I couldn't understand in Rafa's game, was the fact that he doesn't always play the 2-handed backhand as aggressive as he can. I am going to make a video on the top 5 one-handed backhands and the top 5 two-handed backhands in my top 5 stroke series. And I'm not going to tell you whether I'm going to put Rafa in there or not, but fact is that Rafa has one of the best backhands in the world, and there are different levels to his backhand where, yes, he can spin it in and keep it in play all day long, but he can also absolutely clock that backhand, flatten it out, and go for these insane winners either cross court or down the line. And I did see a few of those in those two matches. Of course, the heavy topspin forehand is always going to be there for him, but even there were more mistakes than usual. And de Minaur, for example, didn't appear to have as much trouble with the forehand of Nadal as players have in the past. So Nadal is playing in Madrid. It's going to be important for him to get more matches. He is planning to play in Rome. And we shall see what happens at the French Open. I'm not going to make any predictions. I don't want to jinx Rafa. I have very low expectations, but I am very grateful as a huge Rafa fan that I get to see him play possibly one more time at each one of these big clay tournaments. Now, how about Tsitsipas with the horrible backhand? He made another final, and I do want to clarify the video from last week that was titled Tsitsipas does not have a bad backhand. I stated the following in the video from last week. I believe that it's absolutely impossible to have these type of results, to play tennis at the very elite level with technical weaknesses on the forehand and the backhand. So what I said was technical weaknesses. I'm not talking about weaknesses in general, because of course players are going to have weaknesses, even the best players. Let me give you an example of Rafa. I just talked about him when he used to play Federer. Now everybody knows that Federer has one of the best, if not the best, one-handed backhand in tennis history, but it was obviously the side that was weaker. In fact, the vast majority of professional male players have a weaker backhand than forehand. Now in this particular context with Nadal, a one-handed backhand is very vulnerable against a topspin forehand coming from a lefty. So it was so obvious that, especially early on in the rivalry between Nadal and Federer, that Nadal would hit the vast majority of balls with heavy spin to Federer's backhand, and there wasn't much that Federer could do. So that was a weakness from Federer that Nadal exploited. Now you understand that we're talking about superlatives here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Roger Federer's backhand, obviously, but did Nadal exploit a weakness in that circumstances? He absolutely did. So when I talked about Tsitsipas last week, I wasn't talking about the fact that his backhand is not a weakness. It is absolutely the weakest link in his game, and that's what gets attacked by players. It's not a secret. Everybody during the Monte Carlo tournament that Tsitsipas won was trying to attack Tsitsipas's backhand either with the serve or from the baseline. So of course, compared to the rest of Tsitsipas's game, the backhand is weaker. It's also the reason why Tsitsipas runs around his backhand every chance he gets, which is something that, by the way, all players do, with the exception of a very few, for example, Benoit Paire. So it's important to understand that something, especially when we're talking about the superlative level, can be weak and fundamentally sound at the technical level at the same time. Now you're probably asking yourself, Nick, how is that possible? Well, I'm going to give you another example of a player who was active this week in Stuttgart, and that's Coco Gauff. Very similar to Tsitsipas. There's tons of people that are still, despite the fact that Coco won the US Open, still right that Coco has a horrendous forehand. Now, just like I did for Tsitsipas, I studied Coco's forehand and I didn't find any technical flaws. If I would have found technical flaws on the Tsitsipas one-handed backhand or on the Coco Gauff forehand, I would have made a video about it like I did several times on my channel. For example, I talked about some technical flaws on the Cameron Norrie backhand, on the Iga Swiatek serve, or on the Arena Sabalenka serve. The reason why I don't make more videos like this, because to find technical flaws at that level is something that's extremely rare. And my point in the last video was that instinctively I knew that you can't achieve the results that Tsitsipas had on both clay and hard court, and also you can't achieve the results that Coco Gauff had with technically deficient ground strokes. It's a little bit different on the serve, and it's a little bit different when we're talking about men and women. You are more likely going to find technical deficiencies on the women's side, and you're less likely going to find technical deficiencies on the men's side. But fact is that Tsitsipas doesn't have any technical flaws on his one-handed backhand, and Coco Gauff doesn't have any technical flaws on her forehand. Now, I'm not saying that Coco Gauff's forehand is not a problem. It is absolutely a problem. and it was a big problem prior to the hard court swing last year. Then Brad Gilbert came in, made her feel a lot better about her forehand. The confidence went up. They didn't do any technical changes. But after the US Open, the results started to decline a little bit, and now we are again seeing problems on Coco Gauff's forehand side. So what I'm telling you is something that you might find confusing, because Coco Gauff has big problems on her forehand right now, despite the fact that there's technically nothing wrong with her forehand. And let me just give you one example. In the match that she played against Kostyuk in the quarterfinals, she was down 6-2 in the third set tiebreak. And often when you're down by this much, you have lost the match mentally, and there's a relaxation, the pressure goes away, and often players start playing more freely. And this is what happened to Coco. She hit 2 blistering forehand winners, one from behind the baseline and then one from a little bit inside the baseline. Saved 2 match points with forehand winners. She continued to save another 2 match points, and then at 6-all, the pressure was back, and guess what happened? Coco had the easiest forehand in the world. Kostyuk was at the net. Gauff had a sitter forehand inside the baseline, and she dumped it into the net. So the reason why she dumped it into the net wasn't because of her Western forehand grip. It wasn't because of her WTA takeback. It was simply because of the fact that there's a lack of confidence right now on her forehand, and for the fact that she tightened up. Going back to Tsitsipas, it's true that sometimes Tsitsipas can get a little tight on his backhand, and the backhand can be a little bit loopy, a little bit short. It's not as extreme of a problem that Tsitsipas has on his backhand compared to Coco Gauff's forehand, where the forehand is often a little bit tight, a little bit jammed, and a little bit short. So again, these are not technical problems, these are confidence problems, lack of trust, in other words. And the solution to these problems is quite complex. Now back to the Barcelona final. It's possible that Tsitsipas was a little bit tired because he had some really tough matches going into the final. He saved match points against Diaz Acosta. He had a tough match against Lajovic as well, but this is not taking anything away from Casper Ruud, who played a phenomenal match. I want to talk about one of the most satisfying tournament victories that I've seen in a long time, and that's Jan-Lennard Struff. This is the perfect player. He's got a huge serve. He's got a very heavy forehand. He's got a great two-handed backhand. He's a power baseline player that can blow you off the court. He's a very strong guy and hits the ball very big. He's also very athletic and can come to the net. In fact, last year, when he made it to the Madrid final, he was serving, volleying a lot and giving a lot of players trouble. So you have a player like this who has it all. And yet, this player, who's already 33 years old, has never won an ATP title, which goes to show you how tough it is to win one title, guys. We often talk about these records and Novak Djokovic and Nadal and Federer, how many tournaments they have won. And then people will, of course, talk about Sinner and Alcaraz and speculate how many tournaments they're going to win. And you don't realize how competitive and how tough the ATP Tour is when a player of Jan-Lennard Struff's caliber never won a single tournament. Now, he was in a few finals. In fact, he was in a final of that same tournament that he won in Munich in 2021. And then, of course, he reached the Madrid final as well, and he did win 4 doubles tournaments. But this was so nice to see that despite the horrible weather in Germany, and by the way, for you guys that don't know, I grew up playing tennis in Germany. I don't miss the weather at all. If you see the spectators during the Munich tournament, everybody was wearing hats and jackets, and looked like it was absolutely freezing cold. But this is a phenomenal tournament in Munich, and a perfect place for Struff to win his first title. It was also good to see Fritz in the final, and I have a lot of respect for Taylor Fritz. I'm going to tell you why. Every year Taylor Fritz shows up in Monte Carlo, and then he plays a ton of clay court tournaments leading up to the French Open. Now, all the other American players need to realize that they are not Andy Roddick, because Andy Roddick, one of the greatest American tennis players in history, skipped a lot of the tournaments in Europe for a reason. Why? Because he had a legitimate chance to win Wimbledon every year, and he also knew that he had a very small chance to do well at the French Open. So he would put a huge training block right after the tournament in Miami and prepare himself for Wimbledon, and he did really well in Wimbledon, almost won the whole thing. So this makes a lot of sense for Andy Roddick, but it doesn't make sense for everybody else, because Andy Roddick unwillingly started a trend where now all American players, and when I say all, there are a few like Korda and Shelton who have showed up in some of those early tournaments, but many other Americans don't show up in Europe until Madrid. And how in the world do you expect to do well on the European clay if you don't put in the hard work and you play the entire clay court season? If you listen to the Served podcast, you know that the Bryan brothers were on last week and they were telling unbelievable stories, and the Bryan brothers won the French Open many times. And you know what the Bryan brothers did? Well, the very first tournament in Monte Carlo, they never missed it. They played the entire clay court season. So when it comes to American tennis on clay, the tournament in Houston doesn't count. It's not even the real clay. It's going to be a different feeling when you play in Europe. If any of these guys wants a chance to do well at the French Open ever, they're going to have to show up a lot sooner than Madrid. I already mentioned that Coco lost to Kostyuk and Rybakina played Iga, and I was very surprised that Iga lost this match. Iga also had a tough match in the quarters against Raducanu, who's playing a lot better. She won a couple of matches in the Billie Jean King Cup, so the confidence is coming back slowly but surely for Raducanu. But I regard Iga as someone who can break Chris Evert's record for the most French Open titles. And I was very surprised that Rybakina took her out in the semifinals of Stuttgart. But this is a testament to Rybakina, who has the capability of blowing anybody off the court. She's the ultimate power player and seems to be more stable compared to somebody like Sabalenka, who's also a phenomenal player, but possibly even at the mental level. Rybakina is very calm and doesn't let the highs get too highs or the lows get too lows. In fact, when she wins a tournament the size of Stuttgart, where you get a Porsche in addition to your trophy and your winner's check, she barely cracked a smile. And this is also true when she won Wimbledon, which I think is a good thing, because she's absolutely not letting the highs get too high. Now, if you want to get to know Rybakina or other WTA players more on a personal level, you should check out the YouTube channel What the Blog, and Rybakina is actually completely different off the court than she is on the court. She has her game face on, she's a little bit emotionless, but I think this is a good thing, and she's going to be taking many titles, and it's only a matter of time until she knocks Iga off the #1 spot. I still think that Iga is the favorite for the French Open, but when we're looking ahead at Wimbledon and the hardcore season, Rybakina has the chance to do a lot of damage there and reach the #1 spot. I want to finish this Monday morning rant with one of my favorite players, Sloane Stephens. Similar to Rybakina, Sloane has a completely different personality off the court than she does on the court. And look, she might not be the most powerful player out there, but it is not a mistake that Sloane has won Charleston, Miami, the US Open, and was also in the final of the French Open. She is of the highest of a caliber of player that you can possibly imagine, and her forehand is so versatile because she has the ability to flatten it out and hit winners, but she also does something that's super effective on the WTA, which is put a little bit more height on her ground strokes. Now, she's not moonballing, okay, but she's putting a higher, heavier topspin type forehand, mostly to the backhand corner of the opponent, and she causes a lot of damage with that shot.